Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight for part 5 of our story. Isn't it an exciting story? And we're on the last section of the story, and it's a fabulous story, so I'm so glad you've joined me. But before we continue, if you haven't heard part 1, part 2, part 3 and part 4, make sure you listen because you don't want to miss out on the whole story. So let's continue with part 5 of our story tonight. Little did I know that the indignant, angry outbursts that Lincoln was now projecting towards me and my husband Winston were a symptom of a deep underlying fractious problem after my son had clandestinely discovered that he had been abducted from a beach over 18 years ago, and the parents whom had raised him, teaching him the difference between right and wrong, and how to live a life based on integrity and truthfulness, had been wholly responsible for this seemingly insidious crime. I am certain he must have perceived that the people whom he trusted implicitly and loved faithfully and unconditionally for the last 18 years were not the authentic, law-abiding people he believed us to be. Ostensibly, he had no way of knowing that we had been desperately trying to protect him from knowing that his real father was a volatile, dangerous man, and a personal threat not only to his safety, but our safety as well. For there is no telling what the likes of Dusty Cladessa would be capable of doing, were he to find us. Ostensibly, had we known the bitter raw truth that Lincoln was in touch with his biological father, we would have felt as vulnerable and as fragile as pigeons caught up in a cat's powerful jaws. Because if Dusty Cladessa had found us, we were almost certainly looking at a death wish, and lightly now living on borrowed time. I cannot imagine what was going on in our son's confused, rather muddled teenage brain, and I am not surprised he was spitting with fury like a tormented cobra, as had I been wearing his shoes, I'm not certain how I would react, realizing that everything I thought I knew about myself was based on a lie. So I imagine his outraged outbursts had nothing to do with his teenage hormones going awry. I became alarmingly worried over the whereabouts of my son when I had not heard from Lincoln for the whole weekend, which was exceedingly odd because we kept in touch with each other daily. I tried to contact him on his cell phone, but my messages kept going to voicemail, and his girlfriend Tamara claimed she hadn't seen him for a few days. And this aroused in me a great deal of discord and uncertainty, as I knew that Lincoln was going through a tough time of late. But Lincoln not being in touch with me was certainly incongruous behaviour. And so my maternal instincts were firing on all cylinders with a profound sense of prognostication that something was terribly wrong, and even my guts were recoiling, as deep inside me I could taste a sense of foreboding that was as bitter as gall. "But I don't understand, Tamara. I was under the impression that Lincoln was spending the entire weekend with you. And you're saying that you haven't actually seen him?" "Sorry, Mrs. Astor. He's lying to you. He's been acting strangely recently, Mrs. Astor. And if you must know, I ended our relationship. He was getting seriously weird. He said some really mean things to me that you just can't take back. Frankly, if I never see him again, it'll be too soon, Mrs. Astor. He told me that the glasses I wear make me look like an owl, and that the clothes I wear are cheap and tarty. He's never said that to me before. He was so unkind. It was like I couldn't do anything right. Everything I did he criticised. When I put my picture up on social media after I'd been to a birthday party, he said I was trying to flaunt myself to other boys, that I was a real floozy. I can't let him degrade me like this, Mrs. Astor. I've got my self-respect, you know." "Of course you have, my dear. It's very unusual for my son to behave like that. I honestly don't know why he's been so unkind to you. If it makes you feel any better, he's been like that with us of late, behaving very strangely. But I'm just surprised he's not with you. I'm very concerned about his whereabouts." "Well, I hope you find him, Mrs. Astor, but I'm sorry I can't help you." I was stunned that even my son's girlfriend wanted to regurgitate him, as if he was a rancid meal she'd like to eliminate. What was ailing my son? And more to the point, where was he? But then I got the phone call that would rattle our lives like a storm brewing at sea, beating against the bows of a ship with a forceful intensity.
"Hello, Mrs. Astor. I expect you've been waiting for a phone call. You're probably wondering where your son is," came a man's hostile voice. "I have kidnapped your son, Mrs. Astor, and I'd like $20,000 in cash, and then you will get him back. No questions asked. I have him here with me. Just so you know, if you dare involve the police, I will kill your son. Do you understand what I'm saying? So don't think of playing any funny games with me, because I will know what you're up to."
"Sorry, who on earth is this? Is this some kind of a joke?"
"This is no joke, Mrs. Astor."
"You've got my son! You've kidnapped my son! I just don't understand. Why would you do this? We're not millionaires, you know. We don't have lots of money. I need proof you've got my son. Please, can I speak to him now?" The next thing I could see was my son staring at me on the camera of the cell phone. "Mum, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry." And then the video is snapped off. I gasp. It was my son that had been kidnapped. For a pitiful $20,000. Was this some kind of sick, macabre joke? I had watched movies about kidnappings before. But kidnapping someone for a sizable amount of money, not a pitiful $20,000. This was crazy. "I don't know who the hell you are or what you think you're doing, but this is insane. You need to give me my son back. I need to speak to him now. I need to see that he's all right," I told the man, who was staring at me through the camera wearing a balaclava over his head and waving around a very threatening-looking rifle, which he pointed directly at my son to get his message across clearly. I could see my son in the picture, cowering like a frightened-looking animal, looking so apologetic in the camera, and I cringed in horror when I saw some black bruising on his cheeks. This man clearly meant business. My son had been beaten up, and there was no mistaking the terror in his eyes.
"Mrs. Astor, now that you see I do have your son, and that I have kidnapped him, you and your husband are to come to this beach. The address you will find at the bottom of this postbox on a piece of paper. When you go out to your postbox, you will find it there, because I put it there myself. I will meet you on that beach with your husband at 12 o'clock tomorrow night. If you involve the police, your son is dead. I've done this before, Mrs. Astor, and I deliver on my promises. And when I say your son is dead, I do not joke. Your son is dead. This is only $20,000 we're talking about, no more and no less. So there is no excuse. You do not need to involve the police. I have a clandestine way of tracking your actions, Mrs. Astor, which I shall not divulge to you. You and your husband need to come to this beach alone, where the exchange will occur, and you will get your son back. Once you have brought the $20,000 in cash with you. You are lucky, Mrs. Astor, for I am not asking for a lot of money. I never do. I keep the money small, but I do business this way. So I don't need to listen to your excuses, because you can easily get hold of $20,000. And with that, the phone call just ended. I was astonished. I couldn't believe what was happening. When my husband learnt about my son's abduction, he was mortified. But Winston is a kind of man that keeps his emotions in check and doesn't fall apart at the first hint of a disaster,
which is usually what I will do.
Well, I have heard of a similar case, recently with a drug addict abducting a couple's young daughter, he said. They got her back after they paid a ransom of $35,000, I believe it was. The story never even got leaked to the press, even after the event. The guy would have killed their daughter without a doubt if they'd involved the police. They cleverly did not. Drug addicts can sometimes cross unreasonable boundaries that are exceptionally unpalatable to the rest of us. But this addict was so desperate for drugs, he would stop at nothing to attain them. In the end, he was arrested, I believe, but died of a heroin overdose. So never got to serve a long-term prison sentence. The drugs completely scrambled his brains. But he had abducted over a dozen people this way, to get his hands on large sums of cash.
So you think it is a junkie that took our son? But, it just doesn't make any sense. How on earth did this happen? Where did he meet this man? You don't think it could be Dusty Cladessa, do you? Tracing our son after all these years? It is a possibility, is it not?
Don't be ridiculous, sweetheart. Dusty wouldn't operate like this. He would be here in a heartbeat and would literally decapitate us at the first opportunity. There is no way Dusty Cladessa could have found Lincoln anyway. He knows his son was abducted from that beach. He'd never be able to trace his whereabouts. We've been very careful, and you heard Sylvia Cladessa. Her husband was not the brightest brick in the block. Didn't even think to check his own son's birth certificate. So no, of course it's not Dusty Cladessa. He'd never have been able to locate our son. Besides, we've covered our tracks very well, even though we haven't needed to, and the sheriff has helped us as well. He probably thinks Lincoln is living under a different identity, with a fake birth certificate somewhere, possibly acquired from a deceased name. He has no idea we've got his son.
But are you sure? Are you sure this is not Dusty Cladessa? Because if it is, we're in terrible trouble.
I'm confident it is not Dusty Cladessa. They're trying their luck at extortion, whoever they are. We'll give them the $20,000. We won't involve the police. It's a small sum of money that we can afford.
But don't you think we should call the sheriff? It might be a good idea, just to be certain.
No, I don't think we should call him, sweetheart. If this man is being serious, he may harm our son. We simply cannot put our son's life at risk. Maybe we're being watched by this man. You don't know if he's rigged stuff around here.
It was with a great deal of reluctance and a duffel bag containing $20,000 that my husband managed to get his hands on in cash notes, that in the dead of night, the following evening, we made our way to the address on the piece of paper. In truth, I felt as if I had been cast to play a part in a movie, and I certainly persuaded myself as much, so that I could hold my emotions in check. As if I did not, I would fall apart. I was in no doubt that this dreadful man had already hurt my son, and how I wished I could take Lincoln's place in a heartbeat, so that he didn't have to suffer. I was so concerned about what he was going through.
We are to meet our son's abductor on the beach, according to this note. I understand it's not a private beach,
my husband told me.
It deceptively looks to be such. It is well hidden, I believe, by groves of trees. I suspect the abductor felt this would be a good place to make the exchange, because he won't be seen. But there is a house on the property. Someone could be there. It is someone's private address.
Well, isn't that weird? Why would he want us to be, handing over money, on a beach like this?
Well, I think it's unlikely that anybody is at the property, said my husband. Maybe it's a holiday home, and the owners are away. The abductor has made sure he's chosen a meeting point where he is not going to be disturbed or seen. He's chosen this place on purpose, I'm sure. He wants us to park our car outside a yellow front door. He was very specific about that. He wants us to go down some concrete steps to the beach below with our duffel bag. He will meet us there, and that is where the exchange will occur. He will then hand us our son. That's what the note says very pacifically."
We drove in a stiff, awkward silence, neither of us having the ability to speak, as if all our words were trapped inside us, unwilling to come out, like the last remaining toothpaste left in a tube. The tension in the car was palpable. You could have cut it with a knife. Me and my husband were fraught with tension, unable to envisage what the night would hold for us. We drove past vast stretches of magnificent beach and rugged coastline. At the dead of night, the prepossessing views had been obliterated by a veil of velvet blackness that had scribbled out all the details of everything. Our car bounced buoyantly up and down bumpy roads that had been purged of all traffic, for we saw not a solitary soul in sight. In truth, we felt like the only two people left on the entire planet after Armageddon had struck. The hostile night was vengefully tenebrific, the soupy, thick, cloying air warm and tepid, the feeling in my heart cumbersome and heavy, as every panicking thought in my head was balancing on a tightrope of abject terror, as I considered my son, and I was praying with all my heart that he had been treated favourably by his abductor. I was playing with my shirt nervously, with clammy, sweaty fingers, my throat thick with a bitter taste that I could not expunge, and my guts felt as if they were filled with a team of slippery eels that were slithering in and out of my stomach cavity. My husband's robustly built, ungainly green SUV weaved down the sequestered country road, past lofty congregations of trees that all appeared to be lumpy, misshapen cardboard cutouts on the horizon that were only vaguely discernible, so that everything looked inauspiciously airy and hauntingly monotonous. Indeed, the conditions of the night were so sinister and murky, so that if a ghostly entity had morphed onto the road ahead of us, I probably would not have batted an eyelid. This was the kind of night where, although guarded, I was game for almost anything to happen. The unpleasant, creepy warm air clung to me like the silken fibres of a spider web, as a feeling of impending doom seemed to weave around my intuition like a burgeoning rambunctious vine, whispering into my guts in a small, still warning voice that something was going to go terribly wrong. But I refused to listen to that sagacious voice. All I cared about was getting my son safely back home, away from this horrendous man who had taken him hostage. The bright headlights of Winston's SUV pierced through the crippling darkness.
"I believe this is it,"
said Winston, pointing to a sign that led through the trees which read, "Ocean Spray House." We found ourselves on a long driveway that led to a beautiful house with 2 front doors, nestling on a rocky outcrop, which probably overlooked spectacular sea views. My husband drew up outside the yellow front door, but I noticed the entire house was swathed in darkness, as if there was not a solitary soul around. The people that probably owned this house were away. There were a couple of outside lights on, swathing the house in a bluish light. I could not expunge the portentous feeling that we were being watched. Was my son's abductor observing us, I wondered? At least he would see we had come alone, and had not involved the police as we had promised.
"Are you ready?"
my husband asked me, who had killed the engine of the car. I nodded. "I'll be ready. Just give me 2 seconds to take a couple of deep breaths," I said. "I'm just so worried about poor Lincoln. You should have seen how scared he was on that video. I'm so worried about him. Suppose this man has hurt him."
"Monster," said my husband under his breath. "Bloody monster. If I could get my hands on him, I'd kill him myself," he growled. "What is the world coming to these days, that people are abducting our children for cash, just to support a drug habit? It's sick. That's what it is, sick. But I have no regrets we didn't involve the police, sweetheart. You don't play games with deranged men like this, because this man could be capable of anything." I winced at my husband's words, like a frightened animal that had been severed by a predator's mighty claws, but I was privately agreeing with his comments. When we got our son back, we could put this all behind us and move on with our lives, forget it ever happened.
But I was in no doubt that this insidious man would likely pull a similar stunt on some other poor unsuspecting family like us, in order to fund his drug habit. I was quite sure he had possibly pulled this stunt many times before, and would likely do it again and again. Me and my husband Winston reluctantly exited the vehicle with a vacillating hesitancy, feeling as vulnerable and fragile as two turtles without their shells, embarking on troubled waters, not knowing what the ocean current was like, or whether we'd be swept away by the tumultuous, turbulent current into unforgiving, hostile waters, capable of dragging us under its depths to a watery grave. We trudged down some concrete steps built into the hilly outcrop towards the beach. My husband held my hand tightly in his, while he held the duffel bag in his other hand. We were both wearing head torches on our heads, and abandoned our flip-flops once we reached the cool, granular beach sand. It was hard to believe that this was not a private beach, for it certainly seemed as such. The owners in the large house were clearly away, but for them it must have been an idyllic location to live, where they could enjoy the privileges of languishing lazily on a beach all to themselves. We walked across the ribbon of beach, greeted to the sounds of the obstreperous waves crashing against the sand violently, and charging towards the shore like hundreds of galloping white stallions, made out of white bubbles. There was a half-moon bashfully piercing through the firmament, and some pretty stars peeking through the black veil, like cheeky children's faces staring down shyly at us, as if hoping to have a bird's-eye view as to what was to soon unfold on this beach. Even though it was pleasantly warm, I shivered with the cold of a great apprehension, wondering what would happen next. It seemed like we were alone, but not for long. We saw my son's abductor walking across the beach sand towards us in a purposeful, determined stride. He was wearing a balaclava over his head and carrying an intimidating high-powered rifle in his hands, which he pointed directly at us. He began to issue demands that went over my head, because I was so terribly afraid. The man looked exactly like one of those horrifying terrorists you see on the news, dressed ominously all in black. He was unabashedly pointing the rifle at us, demanding to see that we were not carrying any weapons on our person.
"We've come in peace. We're unarmed," said my husband, holding his hands above his head. "We don't want any shenanigans. We haven't involved the police as we promised. All we want is our son back. We brought you the money you asked us. We are only here on our own." "You'll see your son soon enough," said the man, hurriedly opening the duffel bag to inspect the contents. "It's all there," my husband assured him. "So now, please can we have our son back? That was our agreement." "You want your son back? That's rich," said the man with a growl. "You'd like your son back, would you? Is that right? I'd have liked my son back 18 long years ago. But no such luck, because you both stole him from a beach in his Moses basket." He laughed mockingly. "Ha ha! You think I called you here for 20,000 measly dollars? Hardly likely. I called you here to make you accountable for what you did all those years ago. You robbed me of my son. You stole from me the most precious person in my life." He pulled off his black balaclava, staring at us with furious blue eyes that were burning with rage. "My name is Dusty Cladessa, just so you know. And would you like any last words before I blow your head off and cast your bodies out to sea for the fishes to eat? I've been waiting for years and years to get my revenge on you, and the moment I have waited for all my life has finally arrived. I hoped the day would come when I would come face to face with the couple who chose to steal my son from his Moses basket. Do you know how long and hard I have been searching for my son? But I knew one day I would find him, and one day the huge wrong would be righted, because karma, my friend, is a bitch, And now the debt needs to be paid in your spilt blood. I bet you're wondering to yourselves how I managed to find your son. Well, surprise, surprise, he put his DNA online and we were a perfect match. Imagine what your poor son thought when he realized his whole life was built on a lie, and the parents he thought were decent people had stolen him from a beach all those years ago, and that this heartbroken mother of his was so full of grief she ran away, never to be seen again. You people destroyed my life that day. You took my son, and you stole my wife, and now I'm going to return the favour by robbing you of the privilege of even breathing the same air that I breathe.
Dusty Cladessa was the most unhinged, terrifying man that I have ever met. He was waving his rifle around precariously, and there was a gormless grin on his face that turned my blood icy cold.
"It's not what you think, Mr. Cladessa. You think I abducted your son from the beach, but you're wrong about that. I did not. Yes, I took him from the beach in his Moses basket, I admit that. But your wife Sylvia signed over your son to us. She orchestrated the whole charade on the beach so that you would believe your son had been stolen. She did not want her son to grow up under your charge. She didn't trust you an inch."
"Liar! Liar!" screamed Mr. Cladessa. "How dare you make this all up?"
"I'm not making this up, Mr. Cladessa. Really, I'm not. It's all true. You can ask my husband. The abduction of your child was a cover-up for his own protection and well-being. Even the sheriff saw you as a great danger, and he humoured you by assuring you that they were searching for your child, when in reality he knew exactly where Lincoln was. Your wife put my husband's name on the birth certificate."
The next thing I know is that Dusty Cladessa came up to me and slapped me so violently hard across the face that I was surprised that the impact of his violent punch did not actually snap my neck.
"Liar!" he shrieked. "Liar! Why are you making this stuff up? My wife Sylvia would never have betrayed me like this. She was a good woman."
"I promise you it's true, Mr. Cladessa. It's true."
My husband lunged towards Dusty and began to wrestle with him for the rifle. My husband is a strong man, and he knew that Dusty Cladessa was going to kill us. There was no doubt in his mind or my mind that this is what he intended to do to us. So I watched in horror as both men wrestled each other on the beach. I began to scream so loudly. I remember thinking that I wished the screaming would stop. It sounded like a television blaring away at top volume, that you wanted to shut up. But I soon realized that the screaming was coming from me. I was the one making this insane noise that echoed loudly across the beach. Lincoln's account. Imagine what it must be like for you when you think your whole life has been built on a lie. The two people you trusted more than life itself had done something so dreadful it seemed incomprehensible, and I would never have found out any of this if I hadn't put my DNA online and discovered I was a match with a man called Dusty Cladessa, who was in fact my biological father. I remember thinking there had to be some dreadful mistake with the DNA results, but the DNA was absolutely accurate. Dusty Cladessa was indeed my biological father. I thought I must have been adopted, and both my parents had chosen not to tell me that I was not their biological child. It irked me greatly that they would keep something like this from me. I think it is intrinsically wrong not to tell your children the truth about their biological bloodline. Everyone should know where they come from. Did my mother and dad not realize that regardless of whether they were my biological parents or not, they would always be my real mother and father to me? When Dusty Cladessa revealed that I had been snatched from a beach in a Moses basket, I thought he'd lost leave of his senses. It seemed like something from a movie. He informed me my biological mother, a woman called Sylvia Cladessa, had been so utterly devastated to lose me that she had left Dusty a note telling him she would be back, but had never returned. She couldn't handle the fact that you'd been snatched, he told me. It broke my wife's heart. I remember feeling such disgust towards my parents, wondering how they could be capable of being so damn treacherous by stealing me from a lovely couple on a beach. Did I know these people who claimed to love me so unconditionally, if they were capable of such a great evil? It was like my loyalty had been split into two parts, as I loved my parents. But even though I did not know Dusty, he was still my biological father. I begged Dusty Cladessa not to go to the police. "You must understand, I still love my parents very much," I told him, "despite what they've done. I certainly don't want them to get into trouble or to go to jail. They've done so much for me in my life." Dusty told me he had no time for the police, and how they had done a shoddy job all those years ago in trying to find me. Furthermore, there were no newspaper articles about my disappearance beyond a small article in the back of a paper that was so vague no one would have taken the writing seriously.
"The police are useless," said Dusty. "Useless. Don't you worry, my son. It's all water under the bridge now. I won't dob your parents into the police, given that they've given you a good life. But I want to get to know my son better. I want to make up for all the lost time."
I decided that Dusty Cladessa was obviously a good man. He could understand my loyalty to my parents, and despite the fact they had abducted me all those years ago from a beach, he recognized and respected that they had given me a good life, and was not going to seek revenge on them. When I met Dusty Cladessa for the first time, it was at a coffee shop, and it was a little awkward at first, I have to admit. I had felt incredibly uncomfortable meeting a perfect stranger, but I soon began to relax in his company, and decided I rather liked the man, although there was something about him I found a tad unsettling, although I couldn't decide what that was. I spent a couple of weekends at his beachside property, pretending to my parents that I was staying with my girlfriend Tamara. But it was on the third weekend I spent with Dusty that the weekend went badly awry. We had been walking on the beach together, and then he told me he wanted to show me the outbuilding on the edge of the property that had not been used for many years. The outbuildings were in reasonably good condition, but were old and covered in dust and cobwebs, and Dusty was telling me that he was going to turn them into a workshop. He was interested in fixing up an old car from the 1950s, and such a revelation really excited me, because I love old cars. Then what happened next astounded me. All I remember was receiving a big blow on the head and passing out, so everything went completely black. I remember nothing until I woke up from my delirium, finding myself lying on a narrow mattress on the floor with my hands and feet tied together. I was very confused and bewildered. What the hell? Dusty was sitting on an upside-down paint tin in the outbuilding, just staring at me with a manic look on his face. And in that moment I realized there was more to the story of my abduction than actually met the eye. This man, although he was my biological father, was clearly not right in the head. He was unstable and unhinged, and clearly dangerous. He belonged in a psych ward, not functioning in modern-day society.
"It was you," I said. "Why did you knock me out like that? I'm your son, for goodness sake,"
I said, touching my head with my hands, which was throbbing violently from the hard blow. I couldn't believe that my own father had beaten me up like this.
"That's why I knocked you out, son. Because you are my biological son. Your name is not Lincoln, it's Howard. You are not thinking straight, son. I have to knock some sense into that head of yours, because you are my son. I cannot believe how protective you are towards the two treacherous people that dared to steal you from your Moses basket on the beach all those years ago. Your parents need to pay for what they've done to me. Do you really think I'm going to sit back, let them enjoy their lives after they abducted you from that beach all those years ago? Do you?" he said, growling at me. "They're going to pay for what they did, and you are going to help me make them pay. We're going to teach them a lesson they will never forget," he said, smacking his lips, with the same satisfaction you might feel after enjoying a delicious steak dinner. It made me sick to the stomach. I began to tremble and shake. My heart was literally thundering against my chest.
as if a freight train was running right through me. "You're not going to harm my parents, are you, Dusty? Please, I beg you, don't harm them. Please, for my sake, don't harm them. I love them, Dusty. You need to realize that. I know what they did was wrong, but they're good people. If you hurt them, I'll never be able to forgive you."
"You're defending two people who've done a grievous evil, son. Listen to what you're saying. You are not thinking straight. I'm going to make them pay a ransom for taking you from the beach all those years ago."
"My parents aren't loaded, Dusty. If you're wanting a payout, you're going to be disappointed."
"I'm going to ask for a small ransom. $20,000. I think they can afford to pay that, don't you?"
Everything that happened on that inauspicious weekend is like a foggy, ambiguous blur for me, as if I'm looking back on those events through a misted window pane. What I do know is that in a trice I became terrified of my biological father. Recognizing at once he was capable of a great evil, I became grievously concerned about my parents' welfare and safety, as Dusty Cladessa would stop at nothing to extinguish their memory from this earth. He kept going on and on about how we belonged together as father and son, but how he also needed to extinguish the cockroaches first. Thankfully he did remove the constraints from my hands and feet, if I promised to behave myself, that is. But he kept me locked up like a prisoner in the outbuilding, and was injecting me with a drug that made me feel very woozy the whole time, so that half the time I wasn't sure what was actually going on, and was a bit wobbly on my knees, as if my entire world was spinning. I remember he kept saying to me, "It's for your own good, son. I'm doing this for the both of us, so we can enjoy the life we deserve together, father and son, the way it should be. I know you don't understand what I'm doing, because you've been brainwashed by your parents, but one day you'll thank me for all of this." I recall my mother's horrified face on the phone when Dusty told her he'd kidnapped me, and to prove his point he thrust the camera in my face. All I could say from my cracked, parched throat was, "I'm sorry, Mum, I'm sorry." My mum was crying on the phone. "Are you all right, son? He hasn't hurt you, has he?" I could feel the tears in my eyes threatening to fall, but I managed to hold them back. I couldn't bear to see the distress on my mother's face. Dusty assured my mother that she'd only get me back for $20,000. Dusty made my mother believe that I'd randomly been kidnapped by him, and he just wanted $20,000 in cash for my return. They were not to involve the police under any circumstances, or he would kill me. I had a horrifying feeling that Dusty Cladessa wanted a lot more than just $20,000 from my parents. I think he wanted to give them the impression that he was a drug addict, desperate for a large stash of money to support his habit. I knew that he had an insidious plan up his sleeve, and he then informed me in my blurry state that $20,000 was just a ruse, so that he'd get my parents onto that beach, and then he would slaughter them like a couple of farm animals in an abattoir, and then toss their bodies out into the ocean.
"They need to pay for what they've done. They're both a pair of cockroaches. Then you and I can be together again, son. We can move to Alaska, get a cabin together, live off the land."
He proceeded to tell me he'd killed before, and the evidence had never been found, and he'd kill again without any problems. And I emphatically believed every word of it. I knew there was no reasoning with a man like this.
Please don't hurt my parents. Please don't. I know what they did was wrong, but I promise you they're good people. They raised me well. Don't hurt them."
Dusty then clobbered me across the face so hard with a powerful fist. I don't think I've felt a greater pain before.
"Sorry, son. It's for your own good. You've been brainwashed by your parents. They're not good people. But the evil will be wiped away. When I get them on that beach, it'll be extinguished under a pearly moon, and you will thank me for it. Your parents will be meeting me on the beach, and they will bring the $20,000 to me in cash. I'm going to watch them beg for their lives as I blow their heads off,"
he said, waving his rifle around with a satisfied smirk on his face. I was cupping my cheek because it was stinging and burning, and I stared at Dusty incredulously. I felt as if I was going to be violently sick. This man was going to kill my parents, and I could do nothing to stop him. I was so very glad that this maniac had not raised me. He was seriously deranged. I needed to do something to derail his plans. I didn't know how to reason with a psychopath. This man, who was my biological father, did not love me. His only love he had for it was himself, and he wanted to extract revenge on anyone or anything that dared to cross his path and upset the apple cart of his life.
"Let me go," I demanded. "You're not well in the head. I'm glad my parents abducted me. You're the one that's sick, not them."
What happened next was Dusty grabbed me aggressively by the shoulders and shook me violently hard. His body contorted like a demoniacal gargoyle as he hissed at me like a python.
"How dare you talk to your father like this? You need to learn some respect, my son. I can see your pathetic parents didn't teach you to mind your manners. Everything I'm doing is for you, but you'll soon understand when you finally learn a bit of gratitude, which is sadly lacking in your life."
He then clobbered me again so hard on the head with his fist that I blacked out, and that was all I remembered until I woke up and came to in the middle of the night in this lonely, sequestered outbuilding. At first I felt confused, as if my memory was blank, as I tried to make sense of my bearings. What was I doing here? I was lying on a thin, narrow mattress, covered with a light blanket and a pitiful pillow that smelt of damp and mildew, in an outbuilding. There were long horizontal shelves on the furthest wall covered in old paint cans, and on one corner was a selection of yard tools clustered together in a large tangled heap, and everywhere was covered with silken fibre of old spider webs. There were old bicycles, babies' prams, and boxes of books that had been haphazardly dumped in the space. One wall was lined with piles of firewood that had long since been forgotten about. It was dark and oppressive in the outbuilding, but a soft moonlight flooded through a window, so I could discern exactly where I was. I began coughing and spluttering and sneezing, as I was breathing in some of the disturbed dust. I could see a couple of mice scampering between the paint cans, and a spider caught up in a glistening web that glowed in the dark and looked quite ethereal. I then remembered everything that had happened, and my skin crawled. Dusty Cladessa was going to lure my parents onto the beach and kill them, and I had to put a stop to this madness. I was pleased to discover that I was no longer wobbly on my knees. I suspect after Dusty had knocked me out, he'd forgotten to drug me to keep me in that drowsy state. My head was throbbing violently, but I staggered awkwardly to my feet and managed to find a huge trowel, which I began banging the door with. I had to break it down in some way. I was screaming out loudly at the top of my lungs, calling out for help until my throat became as scratchy as sandpaper. Then something quite bizarre happened. Something was breaking down the door of the outbuilding, and when the door collapsed I found myself staring at a male Bigfoot, and he was staring at me through dark, benevolent eyes. Before I could react or faint from shock, the creature just nodded at me and glided away, before I could even thank him for releasing me from my confinement. But I had a profound sense that the creature was actually following me, as if it picked up on my frenzied energy. I grabbed the yard trowel and staggered to the beach rather precariously. I could hear my mother's frantic screams. I could see two men involved in a violent scuffle together, and I knew it was my dad and Dusty Cladessa, and my father was losing this battle. My mother appeared to be watching the scene, as if she was like a waxwork statue. She didn't even move a muscle. She was so terrified. Dusty Cladessa had his thick fingers around my father's throat and was squeezing, and I ran towards my father, screaming at the top of my lungs, "Stop! Stop!" I was about to whack Dusty across the head with a trowel in my hand when I heard this shrieking sound. It sounded like a woman being murdered. I looked up to see the Bigfoot barreling across the beach at lightning speed, shrieking at the top of his lungs in a strange language. "Ogela! Motola atila kakwani! Otala!" He swung his arms backwards and forwards, and the words that came into my head were, I warned you, but you wouldn't listen, would you? It's too late for my mercy. It's too late. You're a liability." The Bigfoot reached the two scuffling men. He grabbed Dusty's rifle and broke it in half, as if it was just a kid's toy. I'll never forget Dusty's face as the Bigfoot plucked him off my father, as if he was removing a blood-sucking leech from a human body, and he threw Dusty over his shoulders and ran into the icy cold water of the ocean, while Dusty began kicking and screaming. Dusty looked like a porcelain doll on the Bigfoot's shoulders. I could hear some splashing sounds, some gurgling, and then everything sounded eerily quiet, and the Bigfoot returned with a limp body that he threw onto the beach like an old piece of seaweed. Dusty was dead, having been drowned by the Bigfoot. He lay there on the beach with glazed eyes like a dead fish, and all I felt was relief that he was finally gone. The Bigfoot looked from me to my mother and dad, scratched his head, and spoke to us in a language all three of us actually understood.
Kolopatti, Nattilanikwa. I wanted to do that for a long time. The man is rotten to the core. Gilatila, Motola Mika. I gave him a chance, but he would not relinquish his dark energy. Kotola Pisanikwa. Don't worry, he did not suffer. Kolotolo. His passing was fast and painless. Potoli Sinikwa. Best way to go is through the water. Pleasant passing.
And with that, he glided away. My mother and father collapsed into each other's arms with relief, and I realized then how lucky I was to have two such amazing parents. I knew that angels can come in many forms. The angel that rescued us was dark and hairy. Furthermore, he made Dusty's passing look like an accidental drowning, which was fortunate. My parents grabbed me in their arms, and we all cried with immense gratitude to be reunited together, and I learnt soon how I came to being abducted from a beach, and how it had all been deliberately planned, and everything made perfect sense to me. My biological mother had sacrificed so much on my behalf to secure my safety. I knew next that I would try to find her whereabouts, and with the help of the retired sheriff, I was reunited with her 5 years later, and was able to meet my two half-brothers, Steve and Willis, and my stepfather, Fred. The first thing my real mother said to me was it was the very best decision she'd ever made to leave me in the Moses basket on the beach for my mother to retrieve. I chose your mother very, very carefully, you know. I refused to go through the adoption process. It's too dreadful. I was a step ahead of the game and never regretted my decision. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. I'm sure you will agree. My word, wasn't Dusty Cladessa the most evil man? Oh, can you imagine having a biological father like that? I think what they did was the right decision in order to ensure that Howard, who now is called Lincoln, really had a good upbringing. He was saved from the likes of Dusty Cladessa. Who knows what he'd have turned out with a father like that? So there you are. That's a lovely story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.